You are listening to Talking Images, the official podcast of icmforum.com.
Welcome back, everyone. I'm Chris, and in today's episode, we're going to dedicate ourselves entirely to the vastness of space. Not just the space surrounding our home planet, but the space of our collective imagination. Because in that space, there lays near infinite amount of distant worlds, planets, moons, apparitions, and phenomena we can hardly grasp. The idea of space travel, or more poignantly, the idea of discovering these faraway worlds, has been engraved into our very being and have had a presence in the world of film since the very birth of cinema. It is more than 100 years since Georges Méliès premiered A Trip to the Moon, almost 120 years, in fact, and more than 50 years since the actual moon landing. As always, fantasy conquers the ground first. But is it accurate? Of course not. A Trip to the Moon created a vision we sadly probably could not see today. A vision of pure fantasy of the unknown, of the incredible possibilities that lay ahead. And for a time, this was what space exploration was. A mystery, a fantasy, a world where moon men exist, where you can take a train to the sun, and where every planet has breathable air. Of course, this fantasy could not live on forever. Something happens when fantasy meets reality, when the unknown becomes the known. The fantastical becomes science, and the future, as it stands today, becomes the past. In this episode, we will explore how the concepts of space exploration has developed throughout the history of film. We will go through the early years of fantasy, and perhaps more importantly, we will pick up the perhaps greatest debate in science fiction. 2001 versus Solaris. I'm sure by any real metrics, the real debate is Star Trek versus Star Wars, but we're not that podcast. However, we are not just going to look at these two films in the context of being the most acclaimed and respected sci-fi films of all time. Not to mention by two of the most respected directors of all time, Stanley Kubrick and Tarkovsky. No, there is something far more important in the contrast between these two masterpieces. To represent the major directions films of space exploration, discounting the space operas at least, took once fantasy became reality. The conceptual versus the intimate, large versus small. Essentially, there is an idea, and within this episode, we may get closer to figuring out if it's true, that great films of space exploration do one of two things. Use space exploration to explore grand themes and concepts, or use the idea of space exploration to discover truths about the human psyche. In other words, it's a question of exploring the universe versus exploring ourselves. Does this dichotomy hold up to scrutiny? And which experience is more powerful? There is so much to talk through in this episode, so let's bring in, as always, my wonderful co-hosts, Mathieu, Tom, Clem, and Saul. Introduce yourselves, and just to get the conversation going, did you want to become an astronaut when you were a child, or did you dream about discovering unknown planets and worlds?
Hi, I'm Mathieu from France. And speaking on that, before the pronunciation police gets you, Chris, it's pronounced Méliès. For once, the S is not silent.
Oh, bloody hell.
So no, I did not particularly remember wanting to be an astronaut as a child, but I do remember being quite fascinated with space, planets, the solar system, or at least my parents tell me that in kindergarten. That was the thing I was always fascinated with. There was a little part where you had a model of the solar system, and I was always around that. I have a vague memory of that. And so generally, I've always been very interested in space exploration, and those subjects, but not particularly wanting to take part myself. It seems way too dangerous for me.
Hey, this is Clem, also from France. I'm really happy to be back. Just like Mathieu, no, I don't remember being very interested in exploring space or becoming an astronaut when I wanted to grow up. However, recently, thanks to films and general curiosity, I started becoming more and more interested into space and other planets. But I'm very much a beginner in that aspect.
Hi everyone, this is Tom from England. I also never really had dreams of being an astronaut when I was younger. However, I was fascinated with space and stars, and a lot of the science fiction films that I watched when I was younger really connected with my imagination. I love the fantastical elements, the journey into the unknown, and encounters with new life. So I'm really excited to talk about all these aspects today and how they play into the films that we're going to discuss.
Hi, it's Sol from Australia. Like a number of my co-hosts, I was quite fascinated with space and exploration growing up. I was very fascinated by the planets in the solar system and sort of learning like ones like Pluto had only been discovered then very recently by comparison, and made me really wonder what is out there. And I suppose some of the stuff that I also watched growing up, not so much some of the cartoons like Marvin the Martian, that's a little bit silly, but even some of the claymation stuff I'm thinking about, A Grand Out with Wallace and Gromit. I know that's a little bit silly and a bit cutesy, but it just gives that sense of wonder and awe of what actually might lie out there if we ventured out into space.
Yeah, interestingly enough, I think I went a completely different direction as a child. I was far more interested in archaeology and discovering what was buried underground than what was above me. But I think as I grew older, the questions of space clearly flared up. And this question of what was out there has obviously always been a part of the human imagination, whether or not it was decided that both the moon and the sun were gods, or whether or not they were planets in their own right filled with life and human-like creatures. And I think the very first film to actually cover life on the moon and a travel to the moon is, of course, Méliès' A Trip to the Moon from 1902. Even though the man in the moon himself did make an appearance in one of his earlier films, An Astronomer's Dream. So as a warm-up for this episode, I did ask everyone to sit down and catch up on A Trip to the Moon again. So what was your first impression of going back almost 120 years and seeing how Georges Méliès perhaps not even imagined space travel to be, but wanted to represent it to capture the collective imagination of people everywhere?
I think my first reaction was, where are the spacesuits? The moon, just in their normal clothes, no breathing apparatus, and they're absolutely fine. But I really enjoy it.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And the picture of the moon being hit in the face by the spaceship is also a very famous image here. I don't know if that's the case in other countries. I really enjoyed the film as well, for its not very scientific way of behaving, let's say. Not only for the fact that they're just walking on the moon just without any spacesuit, or the fact that the spaceship is just launched into space by a guy pressing a button, and to go back to Earth, there's one guy pulling a rope, and the spaceship just falls back into Earth again. I thought it was filled with clever ideas. I had forgotten that it was made so long ago. But it was a really fun rewatch, and yeah, it's probably Méliès' most accomplished film.
I feel like you guys are being a little tough on the realism. I mean, this was before relativity, so we didn't really know even how gravity would work. I mean, he got the basic idea right. We basically send the big rockets. I mean, okay, once we are, okay, not really there, but the rest is, the start is pretty good. Le Voyage de la Lune, or A Trip to the Moon, is pretty gorgeous. I think it's still the only Méliès I've seen, to my shame. We watched it with the Air soundtrack. That's a fun thing with old silence, is that sometimes for the most famous ones, you get these new modern soundtracks. And the Air soundtrack is pretty good. It's pretty fun. Yeah, generally it's just a very fun film that blurs the line between science fiction and fantasy, as you mentioned, Chris.
I don't really have much to add beyond what's been said about A Trip to the Moon. I would say that it is much more fantasy than science fiction, and therefore the realism probably doesn't bother me that much. I just see it as very fanciful, sort of like the Marvin the Martian cartoons or whatever, and doesn't really strike me as hard like science fiction. But that's fine because it's just merely experimenting and putting weird and fantastic images up, which people haven't seen before, which is what he excelled at.
Yeah, and the perspective is so skewed as well. I mean, the scene where they're taking off, you see them standing on top of houses, essentially, with the foreground being smaller than the background. So it's clearly not intended to be overly realistic. And this is one of the things I love so much about essentially all of Méliès films, which is just the way he uses background and foreground and just incorporates these massive, essentially tableaus of graphics that just work so well together. And one thing I really love about it, I'm not sure if you guys watched it in color or not, but obviously so many of Georges Méliès films, including this one, were hand painted to just create this extremely, at least by today's standards, unusual and incredible visual impact that you don't never see anywhere else, and it always captures me.
Yeah, I rewatched it in black and white, but I think that the first time I saw it was in color, and yeah, I definitely agree. The fact that they had limited colors and they were painting frame by frame offers some very not strange but unusual mix of colors that are quite flashy and makes it unusual for the time and also unusual by today's standard because we don't see films made with this type of colors anymore.
Oh, and just to answer the question from earlier, the spaceship hitting the moon is famous everywhere in the world. I think it's probably one of the most iconic image in all of cinema, or at least one of the most iconic images in all of cinema. You see it on T-shirts of people who probably never seen the film. It's just such an incredibly looking visual. And then, I mean, we could have gone into the moon men who go poof every single time you fight them and seemingly die, and the fact that gravity is just straight down. And we could probably go into the follow-up as well. Did anyone see The Impossible Voyage, which he did 2 years later?
No, I haven't seen it.
We are very lazy people. Even the shortest films we don't watch.
But yeah, I think what's so interesting about The Impossible Voyage is that it's essentially a duplicate of A Trip to the Moon, just with the sun as a destination and with a lot less realistic ways to travel there. So, they go by train into the all through space, but they do have almost exactly the same visual where they drive into the sun instead of the moon, and the sun is a planet and they can walk around there. Also hand painted, but I think for me at least it just feels a lot flatter and duller. It doesn't have the magic which A Trip to the Moon has, even though it's still a good film. And I do love so many of the short films of Méliès, so I think for me at least this was a slight bit of a letdown. I think probably it's too focused on a few key effects and just too much of a replicate of A Trip to the Moon.
I think what's interesting though about Méliès going back to the well of going to the moon is that right away from the start of cinema, it was immediately used for this, right? Immediately cinema seemed like the right medium to explore this, I think, because obviously science fiction is born from literature first, but it feels like it was, it obviously was right there from the start, and cinema has really run with it, I guess.
Oh yes, and especially the concept of going to the moon, which I'm going to talk about a little bit about the next two films coming up, and I'm just so saddened and almost shocked that none of my co-hosts have seen Woman on the Moon by Fritz Lang from 1929, in one of the biggest sci-fi films of the 20s.
I don't think it's actually all that surprising, Chris, considering it's 3 or 3.5 hours long.
About the same length as Metropolis, but all right. If you look at Dr. Mabus too, that's at least 4 hours long as well. So Fritz Lang loved making long epics, and I love Fritz Lang. But one of the things I so often forget when I think about this work, and I'm always impressed by how well it works as well, is just how pulpy many of his films are. I mean, Woman in the Moon really has the plotting of a serial, complete with a child sneaking onto the ship heading for the moon and joining this group on their adventure. And it also has that thing which you see in The Spiders and Dr. Mabus, with this secret organization up to shenanigans versus these upright upper classes that only really exist in German fiction and German cinema, especially in the 20s and 30s. The space mission here is also, importantly, not a state matter, but a private venture by a dreamy-eyed company with its owners taking the trip themselves, along with the professor who created all of the plans. And though the first 80 or 90 minutes of the film is on Earth dealing with sleazy figures and all of this intrigue, it is really the space elements here that blows your mind, because they're just so incredibly well done. It's not necessarily realistic, but they try to capture the G-forces and the effects in terms of the rocket and how it's shot up. It's quite spectacular. But we also spend so much time, I think we're 40 or 50 minutes inside of the rocket on the way to the moon, and just dealing with the issues coming up within space. Though, of course, when they arrive, they do figure out that the moon has completely breathable air, and they do accomplish their mission of finding gold. So yeah, it's a really fun, pulpy adventure that's just made so bloody well, because the visuals, the way it's shot, the effects, everything here is just what you love about Fritz Lang. So did that sell anyone on actually watching it?
I'm definitely intrigued by it, Chris. I am a huge Fritz Lang fan, so it's a bit of a glaring gap in my film viewing history. So I will do my utmost to watch it and complete my homework for you.
I'm definitely interested in watching it. I mean, it is a Fritz Lang film, I mean, just that alone. Regarding the pulpy aspect, I think just generally sci-fi was considered to be a lower form of art in that era. I think it only started to be taken seriously in the 50s and, of course, in the 60s with the film we are going to talk about.
And one more film I think we really should mention before we get on to the main dish is The Cosmic Journey, or The Cosmic Voyage, or The Spaceship, or whatever you want to call it, which is something as weird as a Soviet silent sci-fi released in 1936. And despite being a silent in the sound area, which just seems so contradictory, it looks incredible. They really took so much time to set up the effects here. And the focus, of course, with their socialist realism, which ironically got the film banned by censors eventually, because it didn't like the low gravity on the moon, which was accurate but unbelievable to the censors at the time. There are some inaccuracies, like the rocket is fired from a ramp, but almost everything else is handled correctly. I think this is the very first time we see zero gravity in space, and it just has so much fun with it. It's also the first film that really goes into how much work has been done before, with animals being shot into space and unmanned spaceships being shot into space, and then already having ships land on the moon. They really just go through the scientific methodology here. And that makes sense, because one of the Soviet's leading scientists worked on this, giving them all of the information of how to make it as accurate as possible. And it shows. Some of the most incredible things here are the actual moon scenes where, and I think they use stop motion, you see them jumping over large gaping holes, and there's just so much exploration on the actual moon that looks so much better than you would expect. The plotting, of course, is very thin, and it has some really fun overlaps with Woman in the Moon, in that you have an older male scientist, a woman, and a child, the latter one sneaking on the ship, traveling onto the moon. Of course, there's also a very pro-Soviet message, with one of the spaceships being called Joseph Stalin, and a message of how children are the future. Though perhaps the most interesting thing here is that it's set in a very near future, specifically 1946, I suppose, in a world without World War II, and just how close they believed that they were.
I think that last point you mentioned, Chris, is quite interesting, to see that the action of the film takes place only 10 years after the film was actually made. Because usually in sci-fi movies, the action will take place at least 100 years after the film is actually made. But the fact that it only was set 10 years in the future shows that probably in real life they thought that they could be quite close of actually exploring space.
I also think it's fascinating, Chris, that you mentioned they were striving for realism with their depiction of space travel, and how that is being built upon in the coming years, with lots of films employing scientific advisors to make sure that the science aspect of the film is up to date with the current standards of technological advancement. So it's fascinating to think that this early on they were striving for that realism also.
And to go along with that, what you mentioned about the special effects being really good. I mean, generally the films we are talking about here, they're almost always at the forefront of visual effects and special effects in cinema. That's science fiction has done a lot in that sense to advance visual effects, and it's not just science fiction, but often because it requires it.
That's very true, and I think it might even be easier to create good special effects in space if you want to play around with things, because you have so much dark space, and you have these big spaceships that are quite easy to model. So I suppose in some ways it's a lot about decoration instead, and then you have the very specific effects later on. So in the older days, I guess space exploration and space travel and these forms of sci-fi had a bit of an advantage as well. Though it's clearly not applicable to all. I mean, there's so many other early sci-fi films that we could have brought up, including a lot of quite terrible B movies. And of course, there are other larger films too, like Destination Moon, which is essentially the flip side of Cosmic Journey, in that it's very American and all about the greatness of American entrepreneurs going together to put someone on the moon because the government can't do it, and a lot of patriotism involved in that as well, interestingly enough. And there you have some less than great graphics. Though it's still quite good. I think a lot of these space films just go for it. They go for it in various degrees, and they manage to do things that we remember. But let's just delve into the true meat of this podcast. 2001 versus Solaris, the two most respected films on space exploration. And interestingly, both made in the midst of the space era. 2001 coming out in 1968. The year before the moon landing, and Solaris being released in 1972, the year of the last moon landing, at least of the 20th century. Let's see what the future holds. So let's start with 2001, as it is the first, and its iconic music has in some way become synonymous with space travel itself. There's just so much to speak about there, from men in ape suits to monoliths to the music, including the symphonies, and to the sound design, the special effects that are still held up as incredible until this very day. And then, of course, there's also the quite non-traditional plotting and the final act. But don't worry, we will actually add a spoiler warning before we get there, though it's quite hard to believe someone has not yet seen 2001. Anyways, since there's just so much to talk about there, let's just dive straight into it. What is the one thing that symbolizes 2001 for you?
I don't know about symbolizes, but I think the most important moment in the film is the famous cut between the bone and the spaceship. I think that really is what the film is about, right? It's about humanity and technology, essentially, and how technology is just that, it's just a tool. And so from the bone to the spaceship, it's just a matter of time. So I think that's, to me, the most striking moment in the film that is full of striking moments.
That's a great choice of striking moments. I think for me, it's difficult to pinpoint it to one single moment because, as you say, there are just so many superb scenes that we see unfold in front of our eyes when we're watching 2001. I mean, Kubrick's science fiction masterpiece is, for me, the definitive space exploration film. It combines simple yet exquisite storytelling with an astonishing depth of meaning thanks to the clarity of Kubrick's spectacular vision. And based upon Arthur C. Clarke's fascinating short story, The Sentinel, 2001 traces the key evolutionary steps of mankind under the influence of a series of mysterious monoliths that are encountered at various points in humanity's development. And the way that Kubrick displays all this is just spectacular from the start until the very end. There's so much to digest, and it really is just one of the hallmarks of science fiction in cinema.
Yeah, I'm also struggling to find a key moment in the film. I do think of one moment, but it's towards the end of the film, so I guess it's a bit spoilery, so I don't think I could mention it just yet. I think the most important part of the film for me is the visuals throughout the film that are absolutely gorgeous. It's obviously Kubrick, so we knew what to expect, but I was just surprised at how good the film looked from the beginning to the very end. Just to go back a little bit on what Mathieu said, the film starts with almost the beginning of mankind, or at least what looks like the beginning of mankind, with apes fighting over water and resources.
And the section is literally called The Dawn of Man.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's interesting to notice that the planet it takes place on is not the Earth. At least that's what I believe, because that's where the monolith is. And the monolith is actually on the moon.
There's more than one monolith. That's the whole idea. They're planting monoliths everywhere for humankind to find over time.
Oh.
At least that was my takeaway.
Okay.
Same here.
All right. I thought they were actually...
Or maybe it's the same monolith that moved, but I definitely did not think that it was on the moon.
Okay, I actually thought it was on the moon at first, and humanity just destroyed itself because of it, and somehow got back to Earth, or maybe there were two populations, one on Earth and one on the moon, and the one on the moon just went extinct because of it.
I think that's great, actually. I think that works also. I don't think that's necessarily what's intended, but whatever. I like that interpretation. I think it works quite well, actually.
Yeah, I've never heard this before. We're keeping it in, though. It's a fantastic interpretation.
All right.
That's interesting. It reminds me of Planet of the Apes, although I don't know if it quite holds water, because then sort of you've got where's the artificial gravity then? If the apes are on the moon at the beginning of the film, I don't know. Interesting interpretation.
I don't know.
Do I move on with mine?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So it's really great that Clem has launched into this first initial stretch of 2001, even though his interpretation of it is very different to our interpretations for the rest of us. The most iconic part of the film for me is probably when we first see the very first monolith. Suddenly appears there, and the music changes and everything. When the apes come, they swirl around, it actually gets really horror-like. And it's just such a jarring image in there, and it's jarring for a reason. And Kubrick is really showing us about how much of a difference this one thing made and how sort of shocking it was. And I love the way the sequence isn't just a 2-minute sequence. It actually takes up around 20 minutes or so of the film, because it sort of allows us into this false sense of security with these ape or ape-like creatures going about their daily routine until suddenly they see the monolith. I think every single appearance of the monolith is probably my favorite part of the film. I just love the appearance of it and what it represents, and the way it's so daunting despite it just being an inanimate object.
I think it's also worth noting that the film actually starts with a black screen with just music playing over it that runs for a few minutes. And I can imagine audiences going to watch it for the first time being quite confused. For a while, there's just silence and music, and then you've got all these apes fighting over resources. It doesn't really conjure up what you imagine a science fiction film to be. And it's just Kubrick's way of an intelligent, thought-provoking storyline that really gets you engaged and gets you intrigued as to how this is going to unfold.
I'm really glad you brought up the music, because that's actually the one thing I really associate with 2001, and the one thing that doesn't really get enough credit, except the obvious theme music that's played everywhere. But I'm not just talking about the symphonies here, I'm talking about the entire sound design. Because, at least to me, the film is so stripped apart from emotion. And what really draws me in, at least, is the sound design. It's the heightened breathing. It is the use of the engines and just the way it mixes between symphonies, silence, and these exaggerated noises that not just draws me in, but makes me a bit uneasy. It keeps you on your toes, and it makes everything so much more involving. And I think the music and the sound design really is a major star in this movie.
I totally agree with you there, Chris. I think the classical music brings an elegance to the model work of the ships gliding through space that really seems quite fresh and exciting. It's not something that you're used to. It's a juxtaposition of these huge hulking objects moving through space and then some delicate classical music playing along, and it works really well.
I definitely agree that the use of music is essential to what 2001 is, to the point that I was extremely surprised when I discovered that the music that is used with the monolith that Saul mentioned, and again on the section of the moon, is actually a pre-existing piece of music. It's by Ligeti, modern classical composer. And that was so strange to me when I learned that, because it really feels like the music was made for the film. One other thing I'll mention with the music is that it has become so iconic and so associated with 2001 that it's almost weird to see it now. The first time I saw 2001, the second section, and I guess I still think that is, to me, perhaps the weakest section of the film. And part of that, at least the first time I watched it, I wondered about the Great Blue Danube, that the music that is used with the spaceships landing. I wondered how ironic he was being with the use of music, because now when you use that, it's generally kind of ironic, because it's this very, elegant waltz, and people use it ironically all the time. And I still don't know really, because Kubrick has a great sense of humor in most of his films. I do now think that he was being maybe purposeful with that. It's still an open question to me. Are we supposed to see this as majestic and beautiful? Or are we also supposed to see it as maybe too grandiose, too pompous? I don't know.
I think the music is about the elegance of it. And the music is definitely very iconic throughout 2001. When the question was brought to us earlier, I thought it was just for the most iconic image rather than the most iconic part, because definitely the whole soundscape of the film is incredibly well done. And I agree with what Matthew has said, that a lot of the music is very iconic now. So the point where if it gets used in another film or it gets used in a TV series, that instantly springs to mind. But that's true of pretty much all the films throughout Kubrick's career. He was always big into classical music, and from things from A Clockwork Orange all the way up to Eyes Wide Shut, just the way different classical music is done. If I hear that sort of music out of context now, all that really springs to mind is the way it was used by Kubrick.
I don't think I have that with other Kubrick films, actually. I mean, he definitely uses lots of classical music, like Beethoven, a lot in The Clockwork Orange. But I think really 2001 is the one where you cannot, to me, dissociate the music from the images.
The only song I automatically associate a Kubrick film with is actually not a song that was primarily used for a Kubrick movie. It's actually at the very beginning of The Clockwork Orange, when he's singing in the rain. For some reason, whenever I'm hearing this song, I'm first thinking of the scene in A Clockwork Orange before thinking of the original scene in Singing in the Rain.
Yeah, I think that's incredibly common. I'm certainly associated with The Clockwork Orange as well.
Yeah, really.
Yeah, no, that came up in a discussion that we had about our favorite films. I think a while back it came up, and I said, I deliberately put off watching Singing in the Rain for the largest number of years because I didn't think I'd be able to appreciate it, with A Clockwork Orange being one of the formative films that I saw in the first few years of becoming a film buff.
But drawing this back to 2001 a little bit, there is one thing in the second act that is quite interesting, and I guess most people will probably think it's the weakest unless they really hate the apes, which a lot of people do. It's true. But one thing that fascinated me, especially on my recent rewatch, is just how much it's clear that 2001 loves being in space. I mean, I know it's so often viewed as cold and meticulous, but if you look at these early scenes, for instance, the space hostess walking with the shoes and just focusing in on the shoe to show how it works and her struggling, or how much joy it takes in people switching the direction that they are walking in, it clearly just loves it. It really, really loves it.
See, I wouldn't say it that way. To me, the film is obsessed with technology. That's what it is, and that's how I interpret it anyway. And with technology being both a tool for humankind to evolve and to explore the universe, but also to, as Clem alluded to, perhaps destroy itself. I mean, this was made in the 60s when the threat of nuclear war was ever present, and I think that really hangs over the film. And so I would not say that the film loves being in space as much as it's obsessed with technology.
Yeah, fair enough. I just think that in those early scenes, you have that kind of look, we're in space feeling that so many of the earlier 60s, 50s, and even 30s films. But it is a really interestingly plotted film as well. So we talked about the early minutes where it's just black space and music, and this 20-minute scene with just apes, the prehistoric man, in their surroundings. And then after all of that, we move into the second act, which we talked about, which doesn't really do that much. It's handshakes and small talk and a motivational speech, and a lot of this focus on semi-bureaucracy, essentially. And then we move on to probably the act that everyone remembers, and we're probably going to start spoiling things a bit too, but we do move into Hal versus Dave and the actual things that happen on the Discovery with the perhaps most iconic character of the entire film, Hal 9000, which ironically, at least to me, almost acted the most human of all of the characters.
Chris, I think this is one of the best acts of the film. Supercomputer Hal Kubrick gave life to a chillingly enigmatic character that jeopardizes the mission. And it's notable that the risks and dangers faced by the astronauts at this stage are due to humanity's own making, encounters with dangerous planets or life forms. We've created this robot who is designed to help and aid the mission, but it becomes the mission's own undoing as it progresses.
Yes, Hal very much is the most emotional character in the film. In fact, assuming we are going spoilers from now on, the most emotional scene in the whole film is his death. It's much more emotional than the death of the first astronauts. There's no question about that. I think Kubrick is definitely a misanthrope, and it shows in this film, right? He has much more empathy for humanity's creation than for humanity itself.
Yeah, that scene where Al, I don't know if we can say that he dies, but the scene where Dave turned him off was the scene that I was talking about earlier on when we were asked about the most striking scene. Yeah, it seems that scene looks like someone crawling through almost a human brain almost a system that is human. And it's certainly helped by the fact that Hal is talking to Dave throughout the process, with Hal telling him not to do it and that he will be better from now on. And to see him coldly and meticulously turning off one by one all of his system, making him regress more and more, was truly a fascinating scene. Even though it's just a robot that was created by humans and doesn't have any feelings, it's still a very, very, it's a very emotional scene and almost sad in a way, even though Hal tried to, pretty much kill Dave by not letting him back into the ship just before.
And killed 4 other astronauts as well, mind you. But I completely agree. I mean, it's such a sad scene. He's begging for his life, essentially. And as the memory is removed more and more and the voice regresses, you can just feel this kind of extreme melancholy. And I don't think that was felt for any of the human characters.
The humans have very quick death, while Hal has a very slow one that lasts for a few minutes and gives us way more time to really appreciate and feel what is going on the screen, compared to the other deaths that were pretty quick and coldly filmed.
That's a fair point, Clem. The death is definitely very drawn out for Hal compared to Frank's death. However, I think you guys in general being a bit too harsh on the human characters. I think Dave is a pretty great character. We don't really know that much about Frank. We don't find out much about him. But I think the struggle that Dave has to go through and basically disconnect what seems to be a sentient being, I think is definitely quite heart-wrenching. But also just the way he has to keep up his appearance when talking to Hal, just like assuring Hal there's nothing wrong, trying to look him directly in the eyes when talking to him. I think it's quite a feat what Pierre Delay, the actor who plays Dave, manages to do. I think it's a magnificent performance there, where he's got so much insecurities, but he's not able to let it out and let it show, lest the computer act on it in a way that wouldn't be good for him. The only part of Dave's character which I don't really like, it's probably my major flaw with the film overall, is the lip reading scene. It's very scary when we suddenly realize that our computer is reading their lips as they're talking about him. However, the way the scene plays out, Frank and Dave are constantly looking at Hal as they're discussing him. Even if he couldn't read lips, they're making it very obvious they're talking about him. So that part of it I didn't really like too much. It's something which has got worse and worse for me on each viewing. But in general, I just really love the tension between Dave and Hal. I think it's really well done. And I think Dave is a really great and a really complex character. Although I would agree that Frank is pretty much a throwaway character who does get literally thrown away during the film.
To come to Dave and Frank's defense a little bit, I think it's also a case of humanity simply underestimating its own creation and just not believing that Hal would be capable of reading anything into it. Not just reading their lips, but underestimating the way that Hal was in so many ways sentient. I think that really just thought of him as a machine at that point, and we're not aware that he would be paranoid or have any of these feelings that he so clearly had.
Well, I guess I agree with Saul that they're not being very clever in the lip reading scene, because at this point they're actually already suspecting, right? It's the whole point. It's why they are isolating themselves. But where I do disagree with Saul, I don't think Dave is that great a character. I don't think it's a character at all. To me, he's a representative of humanity and audience surrogates, but I don't see much character in him. And I think what you mentioned about the way he lies to Hal, I think is very relevant. He lies better than the computer. He is colder and more clinical. He's more efficient in the end than the computer. I think that's the way Kubrick approaches this character is pretty damning, or, well, pretty cold anyway towards humanity. And yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting, but I don't see him as a character, really.
I just found all of the lying scenes to be very nuanced. We get it in pretty much close up because we're seeing Dave as Hal seeing him, and just the way that Cara Dulé pauses at certain points, making sure to keep direct contact with him when telling the greatest lies and try to keep his fears hidden. I just think it's a more complex performance than maybe other people make it out to be. He's not just somebody who's lying because he is capable of lying. He's actually really, literally scared for his life about what Hal's capable of doing, and yet he's managing to refrain from conveying that overtly to Hal. I don't know. I mean, I've seen the film 8 times, and I just always feel very in there with Dave's performance, and always really feel for the situation that he's in.
To be clear, I'm not criticizing the performance. I think it's good. I just don't see the character in the same way.
Yeah, I can really see where Mathieu is coming from here, but also where Sol is coming from. I think the actor who plays Dave really has a lot of presence, and you can feel that presence, especially as he asserts himself against Hal in the pivotal scene where he literally jumps from outside of space without the helmet into the spacecraft and manages to survive, and you can feel his survival instinct. But I think the reading of him as a representative of humanity strikes me as very true. And what we really need to talk about as well is the film's actual final act, which is probably the shortest act, but the most odd, the most surreal, and the one that probably had everyone scratching their heads. The moment when Dave actually comes face to face with the monolith. And it's a very interesting scene. You see the monolith hovering, you see his face, and then suddenly we enter into this visual landscape of just hyperspeed. It's like a complete acid trip, and it's incredible to watch until we finally find ourselves in what looks like a 19th century bedroom, a kind of luxurious large bed, and a consistently aging Dave just walk in there confused, laying down on the bed, growing older, and eventually seeing the monolith or a monolith before him and turning into the legendary, I'm not even sure if you can call it creature or image is probably more applicable, but this space child floating and eventually floating in space. The picture that's used on so many posters of the film, but has so little screen time. Like, what is your impression of this final ending? Like, what are your interpretations? What are your feelings about what happened in those last 10 minutes?
Regarding the hyperspeed sequence, it's interesting because when you look at it, it kind of looks like a screensaver now. I mean, it's kind of pretty basic, the way Kubrick does it. But in context, it works great. And I think a lot of that is in the cutbacks to Dave's face. And I think Kubrick really uses in that sequence in particular, and generally in the film, the Kuleshov effect, right? The fact that when we look at a blank face in context, we ascribe emotions to it. And I do think there's a performance here that also allows it, but we really can project anything onto him because the reaction to such an insane event, it's impossible to know what it would be like. And so I think Kubrick is very smart in the way he approaches this section in particular.
I really love how Kubrick takes us on this surreal psychedelic head trip towards the end. And there's a great contrast between the journey that Dave takes through hyperspace at this incredible speed and all these beautiful visuals that flash up on the screen to when he arrives at the end destination of this room and he's faced with visions that may be from his past or projections of the future. And it's never clear exactly what Kubrick's intent is to me. There's different interpretations that can be made, and it's an ending that kind of poses more questions than it answers. It's so brilliantly shot, and it just feels like you want to bask in the glory of this moment. It leaves you kind of stunned, speechless. what on earth have we just seen? But at the same time, it's just an incredible ending to a wonderful film.
I do really like the hyperspeed scene and all the magnificent colors and objects and everything that we see, which sort of represents all the unknowns because nobody knows what it's really like to travel through space like that. The ending is definitely a curious one and a thought-provoking one. What I really love about it is all of the reaction shots, so sort of like Pierre Dulé at a youngish age, maybe in his 30s, looking in one direction and then seeing himself slightly older, and then you sort of hear a noise and looking in another direction, and then he's older still, and then just with the monolith at the end there. And I've heard different interpretations of the ending. I think the one that seems to make the most sense to me is it's sort of about the aliens or some sort of alien life studying him, and they were sort of waiting until humankind was advanced enough to be interesting enough to study over a lifetime. It's definitely one of those endings that make you go a bit hard at the end of it, but in a good way. And with the whole moon child symbol at the end, it's sort of like the circle of life, or like at least that's how I've heard it interpreted. But I think it's just a really great journey, even if you can't quite make sense of it. It's sort of like going into the vast unknowns of space. And that's what I really like about sci-fi films. It's the infinite unknown, the infinite number of possibilities, and that none of us really know what's out there for sure.
So I agree with you that those cuts are great at representing relativity of time, which is a concept we're all kind of familiar with, but that is so hard to really put into images. And I think Kubrick does that in a great way. Obviously, there are many ways to interpret the ending, especially the way we go back to some images at the beginning with the negative images of Earth. My take on it is that there was some sort of alien life that bestowed this gift of technology onto us at the start of the film with the monolith, and we did badly with it. I think, again, it's the very 60s view to me of technology of, well, we created the nuclear weapons and we're all going to destroy ourselves and we failed. And I see the ending as being a restart. Basically, that's why we see again some images that we saw at the start. To me, it's like, let's start all over again and try to do it better because we failed.
That's interesting. I always had a slightly different interpretation, which was that this was the next stage. So the way I saw it evolved in humankind at the very dawn of man and developed humanity in some way so they could get on the passage to where they are today. And now this is the next stage with this incredible space child. But your interpretation works really well too.
I think I have a similar understanding of you, Chris. Basically, it's the idea that this alien species have set monoliths at various points throughout the solar system to monitor the progress of humanity's evolution so that they can keep tabs on how we are doing, whether they need to intervene, whether we're becoming a threat to them. There's lots of possibilities in why they might want to monitor us and perhaps have an impact on our development. And again, it's one of those ideas that is open to different interpretations as to why they would want to be interested in our development.
I think the monoliths are meant to represent the technological development. So it's sort of as soon as the apes see the monolith, they suddenly create their own weapons. As soon as it's dug up on the moon, we suddenly get all this new technology coming about to travel all the way to Jupiter and beyond. So it's sort of like saying that technological developments are really hard to come by, and when there's suddenly such a gigantic influx in innovation, maybe it's not due to something human, maybe it's due to something extraterrestrial, and maybe there's something out there that is pulling us along.
Well, I don't have anything much to add. I think you all made very convincing points. I personally do not have an interpretation of the ending, even though I tried to find one. I think the last 30 minutes or so, or at least the final act, is absolutely gorgeous to look at. Probably one of the best moments of the film. I think it could symbolize, as you said, going back going through space, going back in time, maybe. I think there are a lot of different interpretation that could be made. And I think that's what I like so much about it, that it doesn't give you clear answers, and you can always, give it your own interpretation and make it say what you want.
And that is probably one of the reasons why 2001 keeps living on in our collective imagination as well. And let's go over to its main competitor for that title as the most respected sci-fi film of all time. We open up this episode with the premise that 2001 represents something conceptual, while Solaris is more intimate, peering into the human psyche. But it is also, in a way, philosophy on screen, as Tarkovsky is one of the greatest visual and poetic directors of all time, and which you might know himself said he had no interest in sci-fi in itself or futurism. He clearly paints a more interesting story and tale of humanity itself. We follow Chris Kelvin as he travels to an almost defunct and abandoned space project to see if it should be scrapped altogether. But what he discovers is that the stories that have been mocked for years are true. The planet covered in sea is causing something, and it is more than just hallucinations. Soon he wakes up to see his deceased wife, and the mix of horror and longing is absolutely incredible to explore on screen. But not quite to everybody. We do have at least one dissenting voice in our mix. So let's start with the contrarian.
For me, space exploration conjures up the idea of great spectacles alongside unimaginable peril as astronauts encounter the unknown and try to gain an understanding of the immensity of their discoveries. I feel like Solaris is lacking in both visual spectacles and also peril. It's a subdued film which thrives on existential dread as Chris slowly becomes consumed with grief and paranoia. There are a few visual spectacles, but these don't have the power or impact of, say, the remarkable final hyperspace sequence of 2001 that we've just discussed. And it is at times easy to forget that this is a film set in space. Tarkovsky is far more interested in dissecting the human psyche, searching within for answers to the vast questions we ask when gazing at the stars. And as such, this is a film that I admire yet have been unable to connect with in a way that I have with 2001.
I think if you do view Solaris as a space exploration film, I think you are bound to be disappointed. I don't agree about the visual spectacles. I think the images such as the 30 seconds of weightlessness and the final image in that pullback, I think are just as striking as anything in 2001, or the scene where he falls asleep and the camera sort of zooms in on his face and then zooms out to have Hari sitting next to him. I think it's an extremely visual film. I really love the images in there throughout. There isn't much sense of peril. I do agree that you forget the characters are in space, but I think that's one of the strengths of the film, that it's not sort of married to this idea of being a space exploration. He goes up there to explore space or try and explore some of the mysteries of it, only to get sidetracked by something else along the way. And that's, of course, quite pivotal to the plot, because the planet is trying to defend itself by trying to sidetrack or try and get the people who are seeming to attack it off course. So, look, I understand why I might not be overwhelmed by the film, but I guess the parts of it that he finds to be weaknesses are really things that I find to be strengths. And I've got a few other things I'd like to say about Solaris because it's my third favorite film of all time, but I'll let some other people speak first and we'll see what they have to say.
So I'll guess that you have to you'll have to do a bit of defending of Solaris after I'm done talking, because I think I'll have to agree with Tom a bit here. I rewatched it last night, and I think I appreciated more this time than before. So maybe after a few more viewings, I will also consider it to be one of the best film of all time. But for now on, for only my second viewing, I think it's definitely a good film. But I fail to see what makes it so great, what makes it so highly considered. As Chris said, I didn't know before, but Tarkovsky is not interested in science fiction, and honestly, it shows. The ship looks not really worked on at all. It is quite dirty and almost abandoned. You can tell that those living on that ship doesn't really care about its state anymore, and the fact that Tarkovsky doesn't really care about trying to show a spaceship that looks good and is well cleaned. I think it's really about mind exploration. I was not expecting a space exploration film, so I was not disappointed in that regard. It's really about mind exploration and the barriers, I would say, in our own mind in some way that prevent us from going further and or going on with our life. The visuals are not that appealing to me, at least. I would say I definitely prefer the visuals in 2001, not only because there are no images of space, because there are a few, but it's very, very little, but also because the spaceship doesn't really look that interesting in the first place. The characters themselves are not that interesting, at least some of them are not, even though they are very few. So yeah, overall, not a bad film, but I think I'm still missing something to really appreciate it. So maybe now that you, Chris, Matthew, and Saul are going to speak, maybe I'll see why you consider it to be so great, and maybe I will change my mind a little bit if I ever rewatch it a third time.
I have mentioned in previous podcasts that Solaris is a film that I've watched a lot and that has gone up a lot in my esteem over time. It initially started out as a 5 out of 10 film for me when I first saw it as a 14 or 15-year-old, and I was expecting another 2001: A Space Odyssey, but some things kept drawing me back each time. And after 7 viewings, I'm now very confident of my very positive opinion about it. Just going on to something that you've gone on quite a bit about, Clem, about the ship. It is in a state of disrepair, and it is for a reason. I don't think it's a case of Tarkovsky not caring about the ship design. I think it's the characters themselves not caring. They've initially gone on this mission, and then when these visitors have come up and sort of challenged all the perceptions of reality, I don't think it's unreasonable at all that the ships fall into a bit of a state of disrepair. I do like the ship design in general, with all the curves and all sorts of like the red and maroon walls. I think it's a nicely designed ship. I do agree it's a state of disrepair, but I don't think that's a weakness. It's interesting how you and Tom have gone on about the visuals, because, okay, look, I can argue this, I guess, until the cows come home. Look, I think the visuals are magnificent. Even beyond the visuals, what about the music? I think just that soft, mournful funeral parade music, I think is just perfect for the film. But I guess when it comes down to it, what do I really like most about Solaris? What I think it really does well, I think it's all about the unknown, our fear of the unknown, and how we approach the unknown. I got more of a sense of this on my latest viewing than any of the other viewings. The children at the start of the film are extremely important. They just seem like throwaway characters the first couple of times. You have the boy who's scared of the horse, and that's just such a great, metaphor for what the astronauts find when they come across the visitors. They act in fear because it's something unknown, and yet, as the mother tells the child, it's a beautiful animal. It's not something you should be scared of. And you even get things about the way where the two kids greet each other, and they just greet each other in the strangest, most excessively polite way. I always thought to myself, it's really odd. They're sort of like curtsying towards each other. But then, that's about how they're approaching each other, meeting each other for the first time. And then we have these adults in space, and they're approaching the unknown with all this irrational fear and doing these crazy things like trying to blast the visitors off into space, trying to poison them, trying to get rid of them in different ways, and then trying to attack the planet Solaris, which just ends up being worse for them. I think just much like Under the Skin, the recent Jonathan Glazer film, I think it's a lot about, how we react to the unknown, and maybe shines a little bit of a dim light on humanity in that we always react in it in this sort of like knee-jerk ways that are maybe not the most sensible way to approach something. Just because it's scary, just because it's different, just because you've never seen a horse before, doesn't mean the horse is going to hurt you. And it's sort of the same thing with the visitors, or at least for me.
I think what's interesting in this discussion is that it shows how different those two films really are. They're always put together, and from what I understand, Tarkovsky explicitly said that it was kind of a response, or at least that he was inspired in some way by 2001. But they use space exploration. I do think they both qualify as that. They both use it in very different ways. Kubrick uses 2001 to look at humanity in a very abstract or very general way. It's all of humanity that's being explored, not one particular human being. Whereas Tarkovsky, Solaris is a very personal film. It's very emotional. It's all about one character and how he reacts to what happens in the film. So in that sense, obviously you can still take away from it things about humanity in general, but it starts from the personal, whereas Kubrick starts from the universal. And I think those approaches are just fundamentally different, and of course they appeal to different people. I would disagree, though, with Clem about the spaceship, and I think with Tom as well. I do like the spaceship. Obviously, it's not as front and center as it is in 2001. You don't have anything as, dazzling as the jogging sequence in 2001, which is amazing. But I do think the design works quite well. And regarding the fact that it is a little messy, I quite like that. And it goes back to the opposition that Chris mentioned at the very start between Star Trek and Star Wars, right? One of the things that differentiate them is Star Trek is a very clean design, and Star Wars is all about it being a used ship world, right? You kind of have that with 2001 and Solaris as well. Anyway, Solaris, the last thing I would say also be about what we talk about now is about the visuals. I think, again, it's just very different. I think both films are stunning, but in very different ways. Solaris, the images that really stick with me are much warmer and much more enigmatic than in 2001. I think 2001, it's, even if there is room for interpretation in that last part, I think it's relatively clear what the film is doing at most times. It's kind of evasive, but also somewhat clear. I think Solaris is much more mystical, as is Tarkovsky's filmography in general. And the images that stay with me are especially images from the start of the film, before we go in space. There's one at the very start where we're just looking at plants in the water, and it feels like we are looking at them as if we were looking at something from another planet, as if they were an alien life form. And I think it's the same with that famed sequence in the tunnel, and where we see cityscapes that last for 10 minutes, which is kind of a litmus test of whether or not you can like that movie. And again, it feels like a bit like the film Under the Skin, like you're an alien in an alien planet and looking at this and looking at it in a whole different way. And so I think they just use this canvas of science fiction just very differently. And that's why we get those very different responses.
I also really need to kick back on this idea that it's not really a film about space exploration. I mean, obviously the humanity and the human psyche is at the forefront, but the entire film is about contact with alien life. All of the apparitions, all of the reactions that happens inside of the ship is based on the planet below them. And it's this interaction with a sentient life form that's so different from humanity, and the way this sentient life form tries to protect itself. I mean, this is in so many ways the core of the film. And I'm not going to spoil the ending, but this also ties into the beauty and poetry of the final ending, which honestly works even better for me than 2001's. I think that the spaceship itself, it's honestly gorgeous, and the fact that it is in disrepair adds so much to it. I mean, we go through a long period before we get to the spacecraft, just as in 2001, where we actually learn a lot about it. We see an inquest about previous expeditions in black and white, clearly 20 plus years before. We hear so much about how humans have tried to interact with it, tried to understand it. And then we finally get there, we see it, and we see how it reacts. I mean, in some ways, it's not an exact comparison, but the Chris Kelvin versus the planet, it's almost like Day versus Hal, in that the planet reacts a lot like Hal, or rather it has a personality and a way to react as, a non-character, a character that you don't really imagine as a character, at least at first, but who really just wants to defend itself. And all of that said, what to me is the most striking, and what at least to me had to really click for the film to work, is just the connection between Chris and his wife Harry when he sees her and the way he reacts. Because at first he just wants to get rid of her. He doesn't see her as his wife. He wants to kill her. And this is what the other characters in the film says too. Like this, they do this all the time. They see these separations and they kill them, or they try to get rid of them in all of these various ways. But soon he just can't handle it anymore. He still sees Harry as his wife, and he forms this close bond to her that he cannot break. And I think that it's this dynamism between these characters and between his humanity and his longing and his connections here that really makes the film become this, almost just like 2001, a representation of humanity itself, but in just such a different way.
First off, Chris, I want to say that I agree with you thoroughly about the ending of Solaris. I find it absolutely devastating in the best possible way. It really makes me go, wow, at the end of it, it swims around in my mind afterwards. Another which I thought was interesting is that you mentioned the film, or unless I was misinterpreting it, as being contact with an alien species. I don't think there really is any contact. They don't directly communicate with the planet. The planet sort of induces these hallucinations in their mind. The hallucinations are based on their memories. So he's not actually interacting with Hari. He's interacting with his memory of her and his memory of her mannerisms, and everything from the torn clothes with the space where she's pricked herself with the needle. All of that is how she appears in there. So for me, it's about interacting with memories and I guess sort of getting lost in their mind. It is definitely very interesting as a very different type of alien contact one, but I don't think there actually is any contact. I think it's the planet just trying to defend itself. Although one of my favorite sequences comes towards the end. I don't know if it's spoilerish or not, but it's sort of at a point where you don't just see Hari, you suddenly see the dog and all these other people also appear in the room. And it's right, the planet's got to this stage where it's inducing all these other things in him also. So, yeah, I don't know. I find it an extremely dynamic film, although I don't know I'd call it an alien contact film. I don't know if we'd call it a space exploration film, but it is definitely a film about, I guess, the vastness and the mysteries of space and what actually might happen if we went out to unknown, uncharted territory.
So would you say that what happens in 2001 is alien contact?
I'm actually not sure I'd say that was alien contact either. That's actually an interesting point. No, there isn't actually any direct alien contact. Any contact is done through the monolith, which doesn't seem to have any life or mind of its own.
I mean, that makes sense, because for me, they're both, but that's consistent.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, same for me.
Oh,
To me, they're both, because it's like if we send a robot to speak to an alien, or to speak, to communicate in some way with an alien, we are still contacting that alien, right?
Oh, I don't know.
think that's essentially
I
what's
think
happening.
communication.
Not worth having that. Not worth having that discussion, maybe.
Okay, because like communication needs to be two-way, and there's no two-way communication in either the films, or the communication is one way, or at least that's my feeling. I don't think any of them are anything along the lines of Close Encounters or Alien or Aliens. I don't think they're really along that line.
Well, I actually disagree a little bit on Solaris, because one of the things that especially Snout is working on there is trying to communicate with the planet, trying to make it understand them. And it seems like the planet is trying to understand them in a way too. It's trying to understand what they are doing and trying to recreate their memories in a way alongside this. And we're going to get into spoiler territory later, but that's also in a way how the film ends up.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I guess it's hard to say without spoilers, but I do think there's definitely two-way communication. Is just kind of difficult to... It's not in words, it's not in language, right?
I think the planet is trying to communicate with them by going into their mind and showing them images they are familiar with. I guess in the case of Kelvin, the planet appears to him in a form he's very familiar with, being his wife. But maybe the planet doesn't realize that the images it's showing to the passengers of the spaceships are images that are actually destroying themselves. Not destroying themselves necessarily, but images. Maybe they want to do good and show images to them that they're familiar with, but involuntarily show them images that evoke bad feelings to them and therefore bring sadness, whereas they maybe want to bring good by showing them images they're familiar with.
I think they're trying to look into their mind and find happy moments, right, and find happy things or positive things. I think that's the goal. And where it kind of goes wrong, or not entirely, but kind of, is what you mentioned about them trying to destroy themselves. It's kind of like with HAL, right? It's just once you have created something, it kind of takes on a life on its own. So Solaris is kind of making the same mistake that humanity is in 2001.
That's a very interesting interpretation. I've never thought of the planet as benevolently creating the images. I've always thought of the planet creating the images as a defense mechanism to sort of throw the characters off, and sort of like how it gets worse and they start bombarding the planet with rays. They're creating the images to try and communicate with the astronauts in a civil way or in a benevolent way is really interesting. I've never gone into the film with that interpretation before. With the visitors trying to kill themselves, though, that's something that I have been thinking about more and more with each viewing of the film. And I don't think it's really a thing with the visitors overall. I think it's more with Hari as a character, because the way that Kelvin remembers her is suicidal. So because he's remembering her as being suicidal at every opportunity that he's not there, she tries to kill herself or harm herself because that's just the way that he remembers her. I don't think the visitors are actually that unstable as such.
You're probably right about Harry, actually. I think you're probably right there. I would say, I think you're right in saying it's a defense mechanism. I think it's not contradictory to me. It's basically Solaris is trying to be friendly with the humans so that the humans will be friendly with it, right?
Oh, okay. That's interesting. Yeah, again, I've never thought of it that way. I've always thought of the film as sort of like being about the vulnerability of us because we can't control our thoughts, and the planet can control thoughts. So it's sort of like the vulnerability of us because of our imaginations and the capability of abstract thought actually makes us vulnerable, which is a really scary thought. But I never thought of that interpretation. I will watch the film for an 8th time eventually, or I'm sure I will within the next 12 or 18 months because I like it so much. I'll definitely think about that when I watch it again.
I mean, it's all there. I think all you say is also true.
Honestly, I always thought of the planet with a lot more ambiguity, because I'm not sure if it is a sentient agent or something that simply reacts to what's happening around it and the input it's getting. And I think there's a lot to talk about here, but let's just jump into the spoiler section.
Spoiler warning.
Because that final image to me, or the final scene where everything is said and done, and Chris Kelvin is completely destroyed and thinking about going back to Earth, we go back to essentially the very first shot of the film, which by the way is gorgeous. It starts with water and ends with water, and you have the exact same scene more or less again. He walks back to the house and he goes up to the window, and you notice something is slightly off. You notice that water is dripping, and you see his father inside of the house just as at the beginning, but water is just pouring down on him and it doesn't seem to mind. And you just see Chris leaning against the window with some kind of absolute melancholy as the camera zooms out, and you realize that it's one of these newly created islands on Solaris. And it's just such a heartbreaking scene in so many ways, because it's humanity, but it's not. And I think it ties in with what the planet actually does and what we've heard it do from the very beginning. It seems that the planet in so many ways just recreates the experiences and the thoughts of humans and just puts them into life. Whether or not that is to consciously recreate them and understand them, or whether it's a reaction, is unknown. But there's that final image of half humanity and the sorrow in that. It's just really harrowing to me.
I think the ending links in nicely with the previous point we were making as well, whether Solaris has an agenda, because the image of his father with the rain kind of coming down on him indoors, I can't really interpret any purpose behind that other than the planet just trying to react to the internal thoughts that it's taking from Chris. It seems like slightly off in its interpretation, and that to me would indicate that there's perhaps no agenda behind what it's doing. And it is a good ending. It builds into the bleak mysticism that is quite common throughout Tarkovsky's work. And I do like it, though it didn't have the same impact, the same profound impact as when I watched 2001.
I'm also quite big on the ending of Solaris. I think it's a great ending, and the rain indoors is just such a startling thing when you first see it, because the way this scene is set up, it's all in, I guess you'd call it medium shot or medium to long shot. But it's not a long distance shot, so we just see him like wandering around at home. You just assume that he's back on Earth, and I guess Chris Kelvin does also. He assumes that he's back on Earth, he's completed this journey, and then when he suddenly realizes, oh, it's raining inside, no, actually couldn't be back on Earth, he just collapses there. Because what he realizes has happened at that stage, it's not just Solaris generating Hari in his mind. The Solaris planet has managed to generate the whole of his father's home, including his father in his mind. So it's like he's totally lost in this fantasy, which he can no longer distinguish from reality. And I just think, it's just an incredible way to end off a film. You sort of have this character who is then trapped in his thought processes.
But regarding the ending of Solaris, it's something I still haven't settled on. I've only seen it twice, which is not that much compared to Soul. The first time I watched it, it really threw me in. I mean, I didn't know what to do with it. And the second time I watched it, I felt like I understood it less because I was trying to understand what the ending was doing. I think in the end, there is this interpretation that you guys are more or less on, which I think sees it as a way for Kelvin to deal with his grief, or rather to not deal with it, right? He's accepting this fake version of reality because he doesn't want to accept the death of his wife. But I also think that this surreal feeling, this feeling that it is off, to me, you also get it at the beginning of the film. And especially the rain. You don't have the rain inside as you have at the end, but the rain is very sudden and it's often sunny outside. And that again, it always feels to me in the first half of the film that we are looking at from an alien point of view. And so I always wonder if maybe the whole film is not taking place on Solaris. I don't know. It's an ending that I find fascinating. It's startling. And yeah, it's one that makes me want to go back to it over and over again.
Actually agree with you, Matthew, about the ending and the beginning of the film. In the beginning of the film, likewise, we don't actually see civilization. We just see Chris, his father's house, which seems to be in the middle of the wilderness, or middle of a non-civilized area. So yeah, for all we know, that part of it is also taking place in Solaris. And you get to the point where I guess Chris is unable to distinguish fantasy from reality, and I guess that's a really scary thought.
I think the interpretation that all of it's on Solaris is quite wild, but it could work. I mean, my interpretation of the ending is that it's not Chris, it's just a representation of Chris. But I love that there's so many ways of seeing this. And going back to the opening question of this debate, then, which of these films do you think have the greatest impact, 2001 or Solaris?
In terms of the greatest impact on culture in general, I don't think there's really a contest there. 2001, obviously. On me, I don't know. I love both of them, rate them similarly. I don't know. I love, I don't know. I just cannot choose. I do think one thing about the two that is kind of interesting also is they both have kind of a thriller section. The third part in 2001, and less so in Solaris, but when he first shows up on the ship, it's very worrying and very, nerve-wracking what's happening. And it's kind of the case of all of these films in this genre. There's always something menacing going on just because space is dangerous. I do think that's one unifying thing, even in these two very different films.
I love that you mentioned that, actually, because those first scenes when he arrives at the spaceship and he sees this apparition around him, and you have this little clinging in the air, and he sees the shapes walking around. That's genuinely unnerving. It's done so wonderfully well. And I think another really interesting comparison between the films is that both use classical music in their scores. But to answer the question I myself asked, I guess I can agree completely with Mathieu in that in terms of cultural relevance, there's no comparison. 2001 wins. But personally, I think Solaris is far stronger, at least in its impact, because going into humanity in that way and playing with feelings that are, I would say, intuitive. And this is something both films do so well. We talked about Dave representing all of humanity and us being able to read anything into him. That works. But Kelvin works the same way, and I just feel like the emotions and the closeness he has both to the representation of his deceased wife, but also in terms of representations within this planet's mind. I think that representation of humanity strikes me as so much stronger, because it's just this intuitive association that I at least fell into right away. I can understand why everyone acts the way they do. And then you add in this melancholy and sadness and desolation to it. It just becomes so wonderful. Both are favorites of mine. Both are absolutely fantastic. But I just feel that Solaris captures my emotions so much stronger than 2001 can. And for very obvious reason as well. Because 2001 is, of course, quite a much colder film.
It's quite a difficult comparison to make, and I think this can be the same with a lot of science fiction films that deal with space exploration, because the vastness of space and the possibilities that are out there means that there's going to be huge differences in how the filmmakers depict our exploration of the unknown. And I suppose it comes down to the more subdued introspection of Solaris versus the grand scale and spectacle of 2001. And for me, it's the visual scale and spectacle of 2001 that had the most profound impact on me. I suppose with films that are not so clear-cut and are open to interpretation, our personal experiences can impact our enjoyment and have a decisive factor on what we enjoy the most, and for me it is 2001.
Yeah, I will agree with Tom. I preferred the visual impact that 2001 had on me. I don't know if I would agree with you, Chris, when you said 2001 was colder than Solaris. Actually, I thought it was the opposite. I think Solaris is way more colder and distant than 2001. I think 2001 has this very strong colors, especially a lot of red through Hal and through the first scene with the apes at the very beginning, while Solaris has way more pale color in comparison.
So, in terms of which film's more iconic, there's no contesting it that it's 2001: A Space Odyssey. But in terms of which film I prefer, I do prefer Solaris, but I don't know if I could say that I prefer it objectively. I have enormous respect for the film because it's a film that I started off thinking was mediocre and a film that has improved a lot in my esteem over the years, and it takes a lot for a film to do that, so I really admire that. And it also feels more of a personal favorite. I mean, 2001: A Space Odyssey has been the number one film on the ICM Forum's top 1,000 list for the last few years. It's in the all-time top 10, and they shoot pictures. So 2001: A Space Odyssey is a very common favorite, and it doesn't feel like a big personal favorite. With Solaris, it's a film that is highly respected, but not to the same degree. So it feels more like a personal favorite. Like Chris said, I do think that emotionally Solaris resonates more with me, but I do love both films a lot. They're both in my all-time top 10. Solaris is higher up there. I don't know if it's because it's a more unique favorite. I don't know if it's because I don't understand it. I do respect the fact that I understand it. I guess with 2001: A Space Odyssey, maybe things are a bit more clear cut for me. But there's something that keeps drawing me back to Solaris. And I guess I have enormous respect for it also that I keep getting drawn back for it, even though it's a 3-hour film. And I haven't really had the same experience with 2001. But look, both are great films. It's hard to make the call, but if I made the call, by a whisker, it would be Solaris.
And just to clarify, I didn't mean that the visuals were colder in 2001. I think that's a great point. The visuals are actually a lot warmer, and I love the use of red in 2001. I was more talking about the way humanity is depicted.
Okay, all right. I thought you were talking about only the visuals, but yeah, I would agree with you. I think both visions of humanity are quite cold in the way they are handled. But yeah, now I definitely see what you meant, Chris.
Okay, well, I thought both of you were talking about older rather than colder because I misheard you. So I'd say, yeah, no, that makes sense now. Actually, maybe delete that. I thought that would come off funny when I said it, but it didn't.
There were no one to laugh, so that didn't sound good. That was why.
Yeah, I know.
I was too busy casting the deciding votes.
Oh yeah, of course.
I can
we're
see.
in a deadlock. We're in a complete and utter deadlock.
Yeah, and so after some investigation, it looks like I ranked 2001 just 5 ranks higher than Solaris in the latest ICM favorite movies poll. So 2001 wins this by a thin margin.
By a whisker, is Sol going to demand a recount now of all the votes?
Oh, it's fine. I like having
Stop the count!
unique favorite. No, yeah, I know with the election or no, it's better having a unique favorite. And I think even with things like the big debate I had earlier on in the year with Videodrome versus Funny Alexander, I think Videodrome is more of a unique favorite, so I feel it's more of a personal favorite, whereas Funny Alexander's, a more common favorite. I don't know if that makes any sense, but yeah, the Solaris feels more like my film, whereas 2001 feels more like our film.
And isn't that a beautiful way of putting it? So on this note, on the fact that the debate is, at least for these 5 people, by a whisker of 5 ranks, the debate can be closed. We have declared a winner. We will be back shortly with an assessment of the later entries into the space exploration genre and, of course, the key flashback to Ikari XP1, one of the best Solaris and 2001 sci-fis, and some would argue one of the very first films you could call a modern sci-fi. So, with leaving you once again to glance out at the vastness of space, thank you for listening and join us again soon.
You have been listening to Talking Images, the official podcast of icmforum.com.